So the Lord said, I'm not with them. And then it was at that point when they heard that they missed out, then they decide that they're going to get up and go into this land and possess it. But it was futile because the Lord had already said, I gave you an opportunity to go, but you didn't go. I gave you the opportunity to triumph and be victorious, but you leaned on your own understanding instead of leaning on me. I gave you the opportunity to take that which I promised unto you, but because of your unbelief, you won't inherit it. And so because of that unbelief, the children of Israel spent 40 years wandering in the wilderness. Wandering and thinking no doubt about what could have been or what should have been if only they had believed. But during that 40 years of watching, there is a man named Joshua who, even though he was heart-wrenched, for he was one of two who believed that they were more than able to possess the land. He was one of two who believed in the Lord their God, that he knew that he was able to do exceedingly abundantly above all they as children could think. He was a man who understood that God had proven himself time and time again on Israel's behalf, had given them those concrete examples to prove his existence, to demonstrate the truth of who he was. For remember, that was their God. Right. The God in whom they were supposed to trust and lean on. That's right. For Abraham, when God had made the covenant with Abraham, he said, I will be their God. That's right. And so God hadn't failed on his end of the promise. Right. But we've been talking about, in new conference classes, we've been talking about covenant and the important distinctions of covenant. And one of the things we talked about is that it's a covenant between two or more parties, or a promise of what will be done and what will not be done. Right. There are directives as to what will happen, as to what dictates. It's a contract, if you will. Yeah. When you go to sign a contract with a company or a contractor, there are certain stipulations that are listed in that contract that says, if you will pay me, then I will do this work. You know, if you have a contractor coming to do work on your house, there's a contract that sets out the terms of what exactly they will do. That's right. But that work is predicated on payment. See, sometimes you have to give a deposit to ensure that the work will be done. And then in order for that person to be able to collect the rest of the money, they have to complete the work. If they don't complete the work, then they don't get the rest of the money. Because those are the terms of the contract. And it's the same thing with God. He gives us a contract, so to speak, saying, if you will do this, then I will do that. But as was mentioned so aptly on Monday night, that there's an exit clause. It's an implied exit clause, because the clause is that if you will do this, then I will do Y, or I will do this, or I will do that. But if you don't do X, then I'm under no obligation to do what I said I would do. Because my doing what I said I would do was predicated on you doing your part. See, the Lord has a covenant with us saying, if you will trust me, then I will do on your behalf. I will show forth on your behalf. But there's that predication. We've got to be able to trust the Lord in order for him to show himself strong on our behalf. Because if we don't have that trust in him, if we don't act on that trust and that faith, believing that the Lord is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all we can ever ask or think, then how can we expect him to show forth in our lives? For we limit the Lord in our lives by our disbelief, and we miss out on the promise that the Lord has for us. But in those 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, Joshua was learning. See, he was downhearted by this fact that they had lost out on the promised land, but he didn't allow his desperation, his sadness to get to him. But he took this as an opportunity to learn. For you see, Moses was there, and Moses was a man, a strong leader in the Lord. And so wherever we see Moses during those 40 years, Joshua is not too far behind. Because Joshua knew that at this point that he would be called to lead his children into Israel. And so he knew that there were certain things that he had to learn. For see, at this point, Joshua was still a zealous young man. And when there were men prophesying in the camp, he called to stop them. For he didn't think that they were in league with him. And he was zealous, and he acted out of that zealousness. But there were things that needed to learn to temper that zealousness, to learn how to control that spirit and not to react. Not to react to what he saw in the natural, but to learn how to have insight, as we talked about so aptly on Thursday. Joshua was a man of insight, but that insight didn't come overnight. It wasn't something that he was born with or just happened to acquire by the wayside, but over the 40 years of watching in the wilderness, Joshua developed insight. For you see, he had a leader who taught him, who had been given the law and the commandments from the Lord. And so he watched and he learned and he meditated on that word as he was commanded to do. Right. In Exodus 33 it says that Joshua departed not out of the tabernacle because he knew that that was a place where the Lord met his people. And he knew that if this was the place where the Lord met his people, then this is some place where he better spend some time so that he could learn from the Lord, because he knew of himself he had no ability to lead this people, to lead them in the way that they ought to go, because he had already seen how disobedience could come into play and distract people from what the Lord has called to do. For when the Lord gives us a commandment, it's not for us to kind of take it and to warp it into what we think it should be. But when the Lord issues a commandment, it's to follow after precisely. So those 40 years in the wilderness helped temper him and to teach him how to develop insight. Taught him how to seek after the Lord and to wait on the Lord. For insight is defined as a capacity to gain accurate and deep intuitive understanding of a person or thing. See, what's so interesting about that definition is the fact that it's an accurate and deep understanding. For there are many people who have their own suppositions or their own understanding of a matter, but oftentimes it's inaccurate. Oftentimes it misses the mark. Oftentimes it's not spot on. People think that they understand a situation, but they don't understand it because they haven't taken time to study it or to understand it. So this insight is that ability to gain accurate, but not just accurate understanding, but a deep understanding. For you see, situations are never one-faceted. There's always multiple facets to a situation. You know that to be true if you've ever heard a story from different people's perspective. If you're watching the same event, you have 5 people watching the same event, everybody understands it differently because everyone sees it from a different perspective. And even though everyone's witnessing the same series of events, everyone will have a different interpretation as to what those events mean. But to have a deep understanding, you've got to be able to understand all the facets of the situation, all the nuances, all the insights of the situation, in order to be able to have an accurate understanding. Over those 40 years, Joshua developed that accurate and deep understanding, so that when the time came for him to stand up and face, when he saw that angel that stood before him, instead of quivering in his boots, instead of running for fear, calling for backup, he stood and simply said, "Are you for us or are you against us?" Because he knew that if this man was for them, then he had no need to fear. But if he was against them, then it was time for him to draw his sword and fight, because he knew that the Lord was with him. He knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that this God that had proven himself time and time again would be with him and would bring them the victory. Regardless of the situation, regardless of the battle, regardless of the trial that stood before them, he knew, because he had insight, he knew that no matter what the battle was, the Lord would bring them through. If we would only get that insight this morning and understand that whatever situation is surrounding us, that the Lord will bring us through. For his desire is not to harm us, but Romans 8 says that all things work together for good to them who are the called according to his purpose. When the Lord allows these nations to surround Israel, it wasn't to kill them, but it was to prove them, to show them that he belonged to them and they belonged to him. And because Joshua had that insight, because Joshua had that understanding, he was successful and he was victorious in his work. For the Lord commanded him in Joshua chapter 1 verse 7, he said, "Only be thou strong and very courageous, that thou mayest observe to do according to all the law." Not according to some of the law or that which pleases you, but that you may observe to do according to all the law which Moses my servant commanded thee. Said, "Turn not from it to the right hand or to the left, that thou mayest prosper whithersoever thou goest. The book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night, that thou mayest observe to do according to all that is written therein."